Among losses and memories, Lee finds an unexpected encounter in the chaos of war that challenges her to believe again. Amid letters, faith, and courage, a journey is born where love can bloom in the most unlikely places. The small kitchen was imbued with the smell of bread and the gentle sound of Miriam's singing as she and her daughter Lee prepared the morning meal. The 1941 sun timidly illuminated the Ben David family's small apartment, revealing the simplicity of a life marked by scarcity, but never by lack of love. "Lee, are you listening?" Miriam asked, interrupting her singing to look at her daughter who seemed lost in thought. Lee Ben David, at 22, was rereading her brother David's last letter once again, as she did every morning since he had left for the war. Her slender fingers, already accustomed to the work of nursing, ran over the letters as if they could extract more than the written words. "Sorry, Mom, I was just—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Miriam knew that distant look. David was always a dreamer, my daughter. Even in his letters, he spoke of a better world after all this madness, Miriam said, placing her trembling hand on her daughter's shoulder. The 50-year-old widow's face was marked not only by time, but by the worries that the war had brought. Lee nodded, instinctively touching the necklace she wore around her neck, a star of David in aged silver, a legacy from her grandmother. The small object seemed to weigh more since they received the news of David's death, 2 months earlier, in a distant battle. "I need to go, Mom. The hospital will receive more wounded from the front today." Lee stood up, adjusting her dark brown hair under the simple scarf. Miriam's tired eyes filled with concern. "You work too much in that place. Those people aren't even our own, Lee." "Pain doesn't choose people, Mom," she replied softly, kissing her mother's forehead. "David always said we need to see beyond differences." Miriam sighed. Her deceased son remained present in every decision her daughter made. "Be careful, my girl. I've already lost a son to this war. I couldn't bear to lose you too." Lee smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be back before nightfall." The makeshift hospital in a former school was a mosaic of nationalities and languages. Lee moved among the beds with the skill she had gained over months of volunteer work. She was not a nurse by training. Before the war, she helped with her father's small business, but necessity had become her teacher. "3 more ambulances coming in," someone shouted at the entrance. Lee rushed to help, holding her tray of supplies firmly. She saw the dusty vehicles stop abruptly and medic soldiers jump out, bringing stretchers. "This one needs immediate attention." A tall, broad-shouldered soldier with a British insignia on his uniform was carrying an injured person alone. "He has lost a lot of blood but is conscious." Lee pointed to a free bed and helped accommodate the patient. The British soldier stepped back to fetch another wounded person but staggered visibly. "Are you okay?" Lee asked in English with a strong accent. "Just tired, 36 hours of driving," he replied, trying to sound steady. But when he turned, Lee noticed the sleeve of his uniform was torn and stained with blood. "You're injured. Please sit down," she insisted, already pulling out a chair. "Others need it more." He tried to protest, but his legs gave way. "You won't help anyone by fainting around here," Lee said firmly, beginning to clean the wound on the soldier's arm. "What's your name?" "Elias. Elias Carter," he replied, watching her with tired yet attentive gray eyes. As Lee cleaned the deep wound, she noticed he carried a worn-out book in his uniform pocket. "Your Bible protected you well," she commented, seeing how the book was positioned close to his heart. Elias smiled for the first time. "It was my father's legacy. He and my mother were missionaries in London. They died in the Blitz last year." Lee briefly paused the bandaging, feeling the weight of those words. "I'm sorry. I lost my brother 2 months ago, in Italy." A sympathetic silence settled between them, the kind of silence that only exists between people who know the same kind of pain. "You're not a trained nurse," he observed, without a tone of criticism. "And you are not a doctor, but you were carrying the wounded," she retorted with a small smile. "Taché," Elias laughed, but quickly grimaced in pain. "I'm just an ambulance driver, and occasionally a stretcher bearer. And I'm just a merchant's daughter who learned to care for wounds when my brother returned from the first campaign." Lee finished the dressing. "You have a fever, you need to rest." "You need to smile more," he said unexpectedly. You have a smile that lights up your whole face, you know. Lee blushed, surprised by the personal remark amid the chaos of the hospital. And you need to learn to take care of yourself before taking care of others. It seems we both have lessons to learn, Elias murmured, his eyes starting to succumb to fatigue and fever. In the following weeks, while recovering, Elias became a constant presence in Lee's daily life. Between bandages and medications, they talked about their lives before the war, she about her father's small shop and her mother's recipes, he about England and the missionary journeys with his parents. One afternoon, while the hospital was exceptionally calm, she found Elias sitting in the makeshift garden at the back of the building, reading his worn Bible. Are you feeling better today? Lee asked, sitting beside him. Thanks to your care, he smiled, closing the book but keeping a finger marking the page. I was reading my father's notes. Can I see? Elias hesitated for a moment, then handed over the book. In the margins of the page, elegant handwriting said, The true victory lies in saving lives, not taking them. Your father seemed to be a wise man, Lee commented, returning the book. He was. I never understood why God took him so soon, but... Elias looked up at the blue summer sky. My mother always said that God writes straight with crooked lines. I guess finding you in this terrible place is one of those lines. Lee felt her heart race. It was the first time since David's death that someone made her feel something other than pain and responsibility. Your brother, Elias continued. What was he like? Lee smiled, thinking of David. Idealistic, stubborn. He had a heart bigger than his common sense. He always said that after this war he would build a world where Jews and Gentiles could live in peace. He sounded remarkable, Elias commented softly. He would have liked you, Lee said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the comment. That night, upon returning home, Lee realized she carried something lighter in her chest, a feeling she had forgotten, hope. Days turned into weeks. Elias' recovery progressed, and with it, the connection between the two grew. He helped her at the hospital when possible, translating for British patients and telling stories to distract the wounded. One afternoon, while organizing supplies, they heard explosions not far away. Lee shuddered involuntarily. You are afraid, Elias observed, not as a criticism, but as a statement. Who wouldn't be, she replied, forcing a nervous laugh. Elias took her hand, a simple gesture, but one that made Lee's heart race. Do not fear. If God brought me here, it is because he has a purpose for us. At that moment, Lee knew that something irreversible had happened in her heart. The difference is, he was Christian, she was Jewish. He was British. She was local seemed insignificant compared to what they felt. But the war did not respect feelings in formation. On a gray morning, Lee arrived at the hospital and found Elias' ward in turmoil. Where have the British patients gone? She asked a colleague. Transferred during the night. It seems there is a new offensive in Jerusalem. They needed all the medical staff possible. Lee ran to the bed where Elias had been. It was empty, except for a piece of paper folded on the pillow. With trembling fingers, she opened it. If the road is hard, remember, peace always begins in the heart. Elias. That's all. No formal goodbye, no promise of return. Lee sat on the empty bed, holding the paper against her chest as a solitary tear rolled down her face. 3 years passed. The war was nearing its end, leaving behind a transformed world. Lee remained at the hospital, now as the head nurse of the pediatric ward. Miriam, increasingly frail, depended on her daughter's care. Have you received another letter from him? Miriam asked one night, watching Lee reread a paper worn by handling. It's the same as always, Mom, Lee replied, carefully folding Elias' note. 3 years, my daughter. Isn't it time to leave the past behind? Lee adjusted the blankets over her mother. Some encounters change our lives forever, even if they are brief. That night, after making sure Miriam was sleeping comfortably, Lee opened the small box where she kept her memories. Her grandmother's necklace, David's letters, and Elias' note. She had made a decision that had been maturing for months. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase. You can't go to Jerusalem alone. That's madness, protested Miriam, tears in her eyes. The roads are full of dangers. Even with the war ending, there are deserters, marauders. I'll stay with Cousin Hannah. She will take care of you while I'm away, Lee explained patiently. I need to know, Mom. I need to look for him. What if he's not there? Or worse, if he's with someone else? You've wasted 3 years dreaming of a soldier you barely knew. Lee embraced her mother tightly. David always said that the regret of not trying is worse than the failure of trying. I promise to return, no matter what I find. The road to Jerusalem was arduous. Lee traveled in military trucks when possible, paying for her passage with her small medical services. She slept in makeshift shelters and met refugees who, like her, were seeking to start anew after the destruction. On one particularly dark night, when the ride she was in had to stop due to a roadblock, Lee found herself alone near a small village. Occasional gunshots echoed in the distance, remnants of conflicts that had not yet completely ceased. Sitting under an olive tree, she removed her grandmother's necklace and held it against the faint moonlight. The silver star sparkled, reminding her of who she was and where she came from. A beautiful piece, a voice said, startling her. An elderly man leaning on a cane approached slowly. Do not fear, daughter, I am merely an old shepherd. You startled me, Lee replied, quickly putting away the necklace. Where are you going, traveling alone in such uncertain times? Jerusalem, she replied simply. The old man nodded as if that explained everything. To pray for the end of the war. Or is it for something more personal? Lee hesitated, but something in the old man's calm demeanor invited sincerity. I'm looking for someone I met during the war. Ah, the heart has its own wars and peace, doesn't it? He smiled. Come, my house is not far. My wife will prepare a place for you to stay the night. Early tomorrow, my son is heading to Jerusalem with goods. He can take you. Lee hesitated, evaluating the risk of trusting strangers. But the old man conveyed a genuine serenity. Thank you, sir. Abraham, the old man replied. And who are you looking for in Jerusalem? A British soldier. Elias Carter. A Christian name, observed Abraham without judgment. And you wear a Jewish star. Lee instinctively touched the necklace. My grandmother said that true faith transcends differences. Your grandmother was wise, Abraham smiled. In times of hate, love is the greatest act of courage. Jerusalem rose majestic and wounded as Lee arrived. The ancient city, with its millennial stones, contrasted with the recent signs of conflict. Damaged buildings, military presence, refugees seeking shelter in the narrow alleys. Lee thanked Abraham's son for the ride and headed to the city center, where she knew there was a British checkpoint. The intense sun made her face flush under the improvised scarf. At the checkpoint, a young soldier attended to her with distant formality. I'm looking for information about Elias Carter. He served as an ambulance driver and paramedic. The soldier consulted lists without any particular interest. Carter, yes, he was assigned here until 3 months ago. Lee's heart raced. And now, where was he transferred? He wasn't transferred. He completed his military service. But the soldier hesitated, consulting another list. He still works as a civilian volunteer at the old city hospital. He's here, in Jerusalem. Lee could hardly believe it. Probably. That place is always in need of people who speak multiple languages. Carter fits the profile. Lee thanked him profusely and headed to the old city. The narrow streets felt like a maze, but she followed the directions she received until she found an old building, partially converted into a hospital. At the entrance, an elderly nun was coordinating the distribution of food to needy families. I am looking for Elias Carter, Lee asked, trying to contain her anxiety. They told me he works here. The nun smiled. Ah, our British angel. He is in the children's ward on the 2nd floor. He just returned from a mission in the mountains. Lee climbed the stairs with her heart pounding erratically. Each step seemed to bring her closer, not only to Elias, but to a version of herself that she had left behind 3 years earlier. The children's ward was a simple space, with beds lined up. Children of various ages, Jewish, Arab, Christian, received care from nurses and volunteers. At the back of the room, a tall man was standing with his back turned, bent over a small patient. And then the little lion discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite fear, he recounted as he changed a bandage on the child's leg. That voice. 3 years had not been enough to erase it from Lee's memory. She took a deep breath. Elias! He stopped abruptly, as if that single word had frozen him in time. He turned slowly, and his gray eyes, now marked by deeper lines, met hers. "Lee!" The surprise in his voice was genuine, almost incredulous. How did you find me?" "You left a note," she replied, taking a step forward. "It said that peace begins in the heart. It took me 3 years to understand that my heart needed to find you to have peace." Elias approached, seeming to fear that she was an illusion. His hair was shorter, and a small scar marked his forehead, new details that Lee absorbed with yearning. "You went through all this for me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Not just for you, for us." Lee held her grandmother's necklace. "Because I believe that God unites paths that not even war can destroy." Elias gently touched her face, as if needing to confirm her presence. Then, without words, he embraced her with the strength of someone who has finally found a harbor after a long storm. "I searched for you," he whispered against her hair. "When the war ended, I went back to the hospital where we met, but they said you had left. Mother got sick. I had to take her to relatives' house in the countryside," Lee explained. "When we returned, you were no longer there." One of the children shouted joyfully, breaking the intimate moment. They both laughed, still in each other's arms. "Welcome to my life now," Elias said, looking around at the children. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Lee completed, knowing she had found not only Elias but also her own path. David would be proud. He always wanted a world where different people could love freely. The modest house on the outskirts of Jerusalem was filled with voices and laughter. At the kitchen table, Lee, now 37, was preparing a cake while watching through the window as Elias played with the grandchildren in the garden. "Grandpa, tell us again how you met Grandma," asked little Daniel, 6 years old, hanging around Elias' neck. "It's a long story," Elias smiled, looking at the house where he knew Lee was watching them. "But I can say that your grandmother was the bravest person I've ever known. She crossed a country at war to find me." Sarah, Lee and Elias' oldest daughter, now a history teacher, joined them in the garden, carrying her newborn baby. "Mom, is the cake ready?" she asked, adjusting the baby in her arms. "Almost," Lee replied from the window. "Call your brother Jonathan. He's in the office reviewing records again." "Doctors," Sarah laughed, rolling her eyes. "My brother doesn't rest even on his father's birthday." Inside the house, Lee took off the necklace she had never stopped wearing and placed it next to Elias' worn Bible on the table. The two objects, symbols of different faiths, rested side by side as silent witnesses to an unlikely journey. When everyone was gathered at the table, her 3 children, daughters-in-law, son-in-law, and grandchildren, Lee observed the family they had built. Sarah, the teacher, who taught children about tolerance and respect. Jonathan, the doctor, who had followed his mother's footsteps into nursing and gone beyond. And the youngest, Isaac, who at 20 was preparing to become a missionary, combining his father's faith with his mother's practical humanism. "Before we sing happy birthday," Elias said, standing up, "I want to thank God for this family, and especially thank Lee, who 15 years ago proved that true love knows no barriers of faith, culture, or distance." Lee smiled, remembering the dangerous roads, the lonely nights, the fears she faced. "When I was young," she told the children, "I thought losing my brother in the war was the end of hope, but I learned that even in the darkest moments, God prepares a new dawn." Elias took his wife's hand, the same hand that once healed his war wounds. "True love fears neither distances nor wars," he added, looking into Lee's eyes with the same intensity as on the first day. "It traverses dangerous roads and reaches where God wants it to go." And as the grandchildren clapped impatiently for the cake, Lee thought of her brother David, her mother Miriam, and all the losses the war had brought. But she also looked at the abundant life around her, a life built on courageous choices and love without boundaries. Grandmother's necklace shone under the evening light, next to Elias' Bible, like silent guardians of a truth Lee had learned on the road to Jerusalem. That true faith, like true love, does not separate, it unites, builds bridges, and transforms even the most painful losses into seeds of hope.